Yeah, we're good.
Really appreciate everybody being here this morning, and it's exciting for me to get to introduce colleague and friend, Dr. JJ Apodaca. Try to say some nice things about him and make him feel uncomfortable. You don't have to. I know Steve. But JJ he's a leading voice in conservation and advocacy for conservation programs, especially when it comes to amphibians and reptiles. He's got expertise in field biology, conservation genetics, landscape ecology, and is able to be really synergistic in his thinking, apply all of those skill sets to helping us solve some big conservation problems for some of the most imperiled species in the US. He's the founder of Tangled Bank Conservation, which is a consulting firm that brings a lot of those tools to bear for federal and state agencies, universities, NGOs. And he's also the executive director for the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy, which works to identify priority habitats for amphibian and reptile conservation across the US. JJ got his bachelor's of science in biology from Southern Florida, is that right? And then PhD from University of Alabama, War Eagle. With that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kyle. Must have been painful to say this. What Kyle was just trying to say is that I'm not very good at anything, so I just like do a whole bunch of stuff to try to make up for that. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I think I gave David a list of like 8 things to talk about, and he chose something that I hadn't given a talk on before. In terms of Hurricane Helene and talking about some of our work there. And so I've kind of stretched it a little bit from that to just talk about stochastic events. And I decided to do that through this lens of salamander sometime last week, mainly because I didn't want you all to have the impression that salamander people are all like heaven. So I felt like a need to represent our field a little better. That's a good precedent. That's right. You said you're gonna be my straight man. Yeah. Careful with that. Failed. Yeah, all right. So let me just dive in here. For the always uplifting first slide, that's always shocking, right? Which is that we're in a biodiversity crisis. And I point this out largely to point out the fact that I think one of the biggest threats we have is this threat of defaunation. This cover is actually from 2014 or something, science. And it's everybody that works in wildlife should go back and read this issue, because it talks a lot about how dangerous defaunation is and how many threats we face from this, and that it's expected to basically have more or same level or more damage to our ecosystems and that sort of thing as climate change. But obviously climate change gets way more press, and so we're kind of have been tricked a lot of times into dealing with the biodiversity crisis as like a subcomponent of climate change, which it's not. It's obviously like they're intertwined, but they're closely related. Sorry, I just said the same thing. They're intertwined, but different problems. And so a lot of what I focus on is trying to deal with those problems of defaunation and biodiversity decline and sort of trying to figure out how we unlock how to change that trend at scale. So obviously I've done that by like founding and running large organizations because I haven't figured it out yet. So just trying to scale it up. But I also love a good story, and so I'm going to try to talk about that through the lens of two salamanders here that are near and dear to my heart: flatwood salamander and the hickory nut gorge green salamander. And the reason I want to talk about this is that I'm going to focus a lot on stochastic events today. And I want to compare and contrast these two in a way from a species that has seen catastrophic declines that was once widespread, wide ranging, and the sort of exact opposite of that in a super tiny, narrow micro endemic. Or you all think I'm a total idiot, the tail is a joke on dominant. I just said that I told Kevin I didn't plan my jokes. Totally lied. So let me give you some background on these guys, because really, they're really cool, incredible species. So this one, the hickory neck gorge green salamander, Anides cariensis, it's very near and dear to my heart because I described it in 2019 and have spent many years working on it. But it is when we say microendemic, an incredibly small range species that for a long time was lumped in with normal green salamanders. When we did the genetics, we found that they've been diverged like 12 million years or so, given genetic evidence. And then we did the morphology. It turns out they're actually like really different. They just like sort of look the same. And so people were tricked for a long time. Don't tell David this, but I often talk bad about rabbits and their evolutionary age of the whole group only being a couple million years old. We compare it like all rabbits are only a few million years old. And here's a salamander that's like 12 million years diverged from its closest ancestor. So it's pretty impressive. Or we could talk about red wolves, being only a couple 100,000 years at most diverged. So some really ancient lineage here. And when I say a small range, the way I like to best describe this is that their total known range, and we've done a lot of searching, so we're fairly confident on this, is about 10% of the total size of Disney World. So it's a very, very small range, and within that, very limited habitat, which is kind of shown in this picture here. They need these rock crevices and healthy canopy forests. We know of less than 25 total populations. So even within that small range, there's just a tiny number of populations. Most are only a handful of animals. And again, this is a species we've spent a couple decades making distribution models, doing habitat searches. So this isn't something we just don't know very much about. This is something we've put a lot of effort into looking for and still only know about 25 populations. The most troubling thing is that during that time, we've also done a lot of surveys and modeling attempts and have come up with an estimate of 350 to 500 individuals in the wild. So this would be, fall into the IUCN category of critically endangered. Even if we're missing a whole lot of these guys, they're still in trouble, right? And so just a species hugely in trouble. This is one of the just charts that shows that also in that limited time we've been looking at them, they've also seen declines from not very many individuals to even less individuals, which is also troubling. This also follows a pattern we've seen in other green salamanders and other places of precipitous declines. Not really sure why. It could be disease, could be changing in habitats, the loss of chestnuts followed by the loss of hemlocks and all these things. So there's a lot of things that could be at play here for why we're seeing declines, but we do know that we're seeing declines. And they face all kinds of different threats, just like all salamanders and really all wildlife that I won't go into too much, but I do want to point out a little foreshadowing here, which is that prior to last year, about 25% of the known individuals occurred in 2 sites. So it's always even more troubling when you only have a few individuals in the wild and then they're concentrated in a couple sites. The good news for that is that they're both protected sites. In 2022, the species was petitioned for listing under the ESA, and we've been working with Fish and Wildlife Service to push that process forward. We had at one point talked about an emergency listing, but we've kind of decided that that's not the best approach, but this is obviously a species that will be listed in the next few years. And I'm told that that actually will happen in this administration. So we'll see. Fish and Wildlife Service says that that's not a dead deal in this administration, at least for tiny range things that don't have any huge economic impact. Okay, on the other side of the range gamut here, we have flatwood salamanders, which many of you are probably somewhat familiar with, or hopefully familiar with. This is another like just incredibly amazing and beautiful species, and but have seen just catastrophic habitat losses and declines of the species. So many of us are pretty familiar with the plight of longleaf pine and their decline, and this is a species that is literally like the poster child of that decline, and have probably taken a hit worse than any other species that I know of. And most of that is due to fire exclusion, reducing their habitat. And I'd like to point out how important fire is for this species, because this is what a good flatwoods salamander habitat looks like. This is 3 to 5 years without a burn. So not only is it have they lost habitat from the loss of longleaf pine, but also it's an incredibly intensive process to keep their habitats on the ground when we don't have a natural fire cycle. So that 3 to 5 years comes extremely quickly, and even in the best years and best agencies and efforts, it's hard to get that kind of management at scale to keep this species moving forward and in recovery. So I mentioned they're widespread. At one point, they were probably found mostly throughout the longleaf range. So this is what the longleaf range looks like today. In red and purple is the historic range. So there's, it's gone from 95 million acres to 4 to 6 million acres, depending on how you categorize some of that. There's a lot of money going on the ground right now to try to get that to 8 million acres, and that's had a lot of success lately, but that's still a small percentage of what it used to be. And so this species, the frosted flatwood salamander, this is its historic range with the orange as historic localities. However, those stars are the only populations we know that are left. So again, always a threat when you're down to only a few populations. Now these would be several ponds within a meta population in each of these, but it's still a troubling sight to go down to that. And the one in Georgia there, up until the last couple of years, there had only been a few larvae of the species found over the last decade to 2 decades. So it's not a large, healthy population or anything. But something. Okay, so how do we deal with this as a field? Well, I think this is part of the main problem. This is what I'll hit on, is that our response to the biodiversity crisis has largely been these large frameworks, right? At the global scale, we've had international treaties and things like that, like 30 by 30 to protect 30% of the land or 30% of the ocean. By 2030, there's been things like UN decades of ecosystem restoration. And then, of course, at the national and state level, we have these large scale plans to try to protect biodiversity or to try to restore biodiversity in some cases. But as you can tell from my title, There's also some major problems. On the implementation front, on our side, on the active conservation side, what this looks like to me is like a really tremendous amount of ambition, but a persistent implementation failure. And I'll get into more what I mean by that, but just like in general, half of all biodiversity targets since 2000 have been missed. So all these treaties have again and again laid out guidelines, and we fail at them over and over. And more importantly, extinction rates continue to rise. And as we all know, like recovery is pretty rare, right? It's a pretty hard thing to recover an endangered species that we don't see all the time. I didn't expect this to be this depressing when I wrote it. We'll try to get to some good news and how to fix this. But it's important to think about all this. So what do these big frameworks look like on the ground? And I frame this, I said some of this before, but big framework problems. A lot of these problems relate back to things like targets are a lot easier to announce than to implement. So it's a lot easier for people to sit in a room and say, what are we going to target? And like make some broad goals than they are to actually implement. And then on the landscape, a lot of those goals are problematic economically to implement. It's a lot cheaper to buy mountain habitat, for example, than it is to buy coastal plain habitat. And so we get a disproportionate amount of certain habitat types. Those frameworks often just focus on area protected and not the threats reduced, as we'll talk a lot about. Those threats are really important for a lot of these species. So in other words, taking habitat and putting it into protection doesn't really reduce threats in a lot of cases. And the threats are what's actually driving species to decline. We get really poor funding in governments, things we call paper parks, right? We see how we've seen in this administration how ephemeral some of those can be. Presidents can designate certain areas as protected, other presidents can come in and change that, and same things happening with states. And there's really just like a disconnect in the time that this is going to respond as well. If we're not actively managing and we're just setting habitat aside, then the species are collapsing now. Time it's going to take to get those habitats back to do good is going to take decades or centuries. But most importantly, I think, and really like the takeaway point of this talk here is that protecting habitat does not equal recovering species. So most of these imperiled species are past the point where saving their habitat and leaving them alone will result in recovery, right? It's just not going to happen. We like to point at like recovery success stories of things like bald eagles and American alligators from the ESA. And those are species where all you had to do was remove one threat, right? DDT or hunting, and the species comes back. But in reality, that very rarely happens. Even success stories like red cockaded woodpeckers have taken translocating birds and putting in nests and that sort of stuff. I do love this example of kind of lesser known example of Lake Erie water snake that was recovered. And this was a very fortunate case that we got extremely lucky on, where the threat was removed. In this case, it was just getting people to stop killing snakes on their docks and things in Lake Erie. But then it was like coupled with a very fortunate invasion of an invasive species of an invasive goby that just like was dumb and made great food, and so snakes boomed. But that's not the case for most species. And the reason for that is the extinction vortex. So I won't go into this too much, but it's a classic case in conservation biology where these small fragmented isolated populations lose genetic diversity, they become inbred, and because they're inbred, they have lower fecundity, they have lower survivability, they have lower adaptability, you lose more speed or more individuals, and then you just keep going down that vortex. Until you get local extinction or local extirpation, and ultimately extinction of the whole species. And I can honestly say that I've thought a lot about the extinction vortex over over my whole career. It's been focused on always being focused on small, narrow endemics and endangered species. But until the last couple of years, especially after last year, I never really thought much of the stochastic nature of catastrophes and the impact they could have on this. The one famous example of this that you see in textbooks is the heath hen, right? Which is a bird that went extinct on Martha's Vineyard. It was once wide ranging. Last population was on Martha's Vineyard. They thought it was safe. It was in an Audubon protected area. And then a massive fire went through and wiped it out in the 1930s. But I had never heard of a major catastrophe really playing such a role in reducing the viability of the species beyond that. I got a little dangerous foreshadowing. And so when you look at these two species, they're really set up for this recipe for disaster, right? They've had same as the heath hen. They've had amazing amount of habitat loss, the loss of these functioning metapopulations, catastrophic population declines. And then if you combine that, this final step of stochastic losses, you're really just setting these things up for extinction. And so we have to take some pretty drastic steps to stop that from happening. So of course, when you have a recipe for disaster, you also eventually get actual disasters. For the flatwood salamanders, that looks like this. This is Hurricane Michael. And for a little context of how this impacts flatwood salamanders, again, here's the range in those last two major populations in the Florida Panhandle. Well, we watched in horror as the strongest hurricane to make landfall in the United States since Andrew hit in 2018, right there in the Panhandle. Brent brought a 13-foot storm surge. It's still the strongest hurricane to ever hit the Florida Panhandle. And because of other catastrophic hurricanes that we've had, you don't hear a lot about it, but this was a category 5 with just an amazing amount of force that hit. And this actually ended up wiping out a number of ponds close to the ocean in this second star here, which had already in that population had already gone from about 50 occupied ponds in the early 2000s to about 9 before Hurricane Michael. And then you just got all kinds of saltwater intrusion there. So obviously a huge worry for the species. And then of course, storm a lot of us dealt with, Hurricane Helene. And one of the things that people talk about is the amount of damage with Helene. But I don't think a lot of people actually realize just how giant this storm is. And so this is one of my favorite pictures that I like to show of it, of just the amazing size. This is the entire United States. So this was a giant storm. It wasn't just that it was strong, but it was giant. Some of the estimates derived from the radar and the flood gauges and everything show that just in Western North Carolina, the storm dumped 40 trillion gallons of water on Western North Carolina. That number is impossible to grasp, right? Because it's so big. But to put that into a little perspective, Lake Tahoe is 39 trillion gallons. So if you think about Lake Tahoe being dropped on a region, if you've ever seen Lake Tahoe, or it's enough water to cover the entire US with nearly 2 inches of water, which is, again, mind-blowing. And another one that I love is that amount of water can supply every person on Earth with fresh water for 4 years, not at survival levels, but at normal American showering, running your dishwasher, 82 gallons a day. So it's just an incredible amount of water. even though the species that I'm talking about isn't an aquatic species, and a lot of you are familiar with the effects that this had on hellbenders and things like that. But this, we're just talking about 40 trillion gallons of water being dumped on the landscape. And what that really did was it impacted a whole lot of forests as well. So the North Carolina Forest Service has estimated that 822,000 acres of forested timberland were damaged. And to put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of the Yosemite National Park. And so we're getting this like double tragedy from this storm of flooding and just a huge amount of canopy loss from, in a lot of cases, I'm not sure if it happened as much here. You know, you all got hit a lot, but in Asheville, where I'm from, it wasn't so much trees snapping in half, it was just literally trees falling over. There was so much water on the ground that their roots wouldn't hold. And of course, for salamanders, many of which breathe through their skin and require moist skin, the effects of losing your canopy like that are really bad. This is a natural disaster that, you know, people are already moving past, but that is going to plague the region for a long time because of that. You know, the loss of the canopy, the increased water temperatures, the increased amount of sediment heading into the rivers. So for our salamander that we're talking about here, the hickory nut gorge green, what kind of effect did that have on that tiny range? Well, this is the majority of that range. And this is a change analysis that we were able to complete about 3 weeks after the storm hit. So what you're seeing is green was not very much affected, but pink is completely different canopy and landscape. And so obviously you don't need to know the region to know that that's a whole lot of change from the one storm, and really concerning for a species that's found in only a few hundred or 1,000 hectares. And what that looked like on the ground is this. So I was able to get out to some of our sites about a month after the storm. If any of you have been in the Hickory Nut Gorge, it is the worst natural disaster I've ever seen in person, and I've seen a lot of natural disasters in person. But the destruction in the gorge was amazing. So when I look back now, when I go in the gorge now, I'm amazed that somehow I got in there a month after. But I was able to get in and get a drone up in the air. And so you see the river bottoms are just destroyed, but you also can hopefully get a feel for the canopy and how destroyed and broken up it is, but also then landslides. So the very unfortunate thing about this for this species was that, if you remember, I said that 2 of those populations contained about 25% of the total known individuals for the about 12% of those individuals were found right here. So completely destroyed habitat, completely opened up. And this was a site that I had, in a very stupid way, the year before, taken a film crew out to and said, this is the one site we have no worries about, because every other site, even protected sites, had people could get into. This was a controlled access site. Poachers could get in there. Other sites that, you know, could be developed or whatever. This was the one I said, like, we've got no worries. This one's perfect. It's controlled by the Nature Conservancy. Nothing will ever happen. Like I said, I'm not very bright. So that's what it looked like from the sky. And then, of course, just on the landscape, you know, we saw an incredible loss of canopy through here. So I don't know if you can see this from back there, but all these beautiful, what were really definitely old growth. I think it was probably a lot of virgin forests in here because the steeps were so slow it could never be harvested. But these old amazing trees just like sawed in half, pushed over, which again completely changes the habitat for the species. Okay, so that was depressing, sorry. So what do we do? How do we fix this? How do we move forward with these species and with others to build systems where we can not be completely depressed all the time? Which a lot of people always ask me, like, isn't working in conservation depressing? And I'm like, no, it's great. And then they come in and give a talk like this. But there is a lot of hope out there. And so what we're working on is really thinking a lot about how do we recover species at scale, again, like thinking about the number of species. Again, obviously we work a lot on amphibians and reptiles, but this could be made for anything. And some of the things I've noticed is that there's a huge mismatch between the effort being put into conservation and the desired outcomes. And I love to think of conservation biology in this way. And I totally stole this from an old medical principle called the Osler principle. But I think it really describes how we need to move forward as an entire field of conservation. And that's that conservation biology can be thought of as a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. If you think about that a little bit more, that's right. That's how medicine operates. You've got the science of it is trying to reduce the uncertainty. It's trying to give us better information. But unless you have that art part, the probability of enacting that, of putting action in conservation on the ground, then it's not going to do anything, right? And I always use the example of talking about, like, imagine having a heart attack and going to the doctor and they were like, we know exactly why you're dying, but we can't do anything about it, right? Right? Or like, there's a little bit of uncertainty. You don't want that, you don't want them to have that uncertainty, like freeze them to stop from putting a stent in your heart, right? They've got to take the information they have, they've got to act on it. And that's what we as a field need to get a lot better at, if we're gonna stem this loss. And so that's really what we've been building and working on, is this framework where implementation is on equal ground with large scale prioritization and preservation and conservation and science planning, right? We see a whole bunch of science planning. We see a whole lot of like structured decision making of like, you know, putting that decision making in practice, but we don't see that same effort put into the implementation. And I think of it like prioritization and decision making is like joining a gym. So if you ever really want to get in shape, you have to go work out, right? And Kyle's gonna be like, you just go run, but it, like, it's not really my metaphor, Kyle. This is. And so at ARC, we've implemented this approach to do this for amphibians and reptiles across the country. We have a broad prioritization strategy, which we call PARCAs, Priority Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Areas. And those are areas where we've done spatial modeling. We put a lot of decision making in to decide this is where we can make a difference. We use science informed decisions to make a plan, but then we actually get on the ground and we actually do a lot of that work. So what does that look like? Oh, and I focus a lot on the 3 R's, which we'll skip for now. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, for the flatwood salamanders that we were talking about, we do a lot of focal species habitat surveys. So we've got to understand where they're at on the ground to be able to make a difference. And then we do a whole lot of wetland restoration and management. And I showed you what it looks like when it grows over. A lot of those wetlands that were historic sites or that are potential sites have gotten past the point where fire is even going to do anything. So we do a lot of like either manual removal with chainsaws and brush cutters, or with mulching and getting that out so that we can then get fire in there. And so we do a lot of that. And then we do a whole bunch of imperiled species head starting. So again, we're to this point where leaving them to their own devices to recover is not going to work. And so we have to take that next step and get them out into the wild and improve their chances. And this has been really successful for this species. So this is a species that 15 years ago, I was pretty convinced was going to go extinct, but today, I think we're to the point where we at least have a really good fighting chance to recover the species. And a lot of that is because of this work of getting out there, finding new habitats and restoring them. One of the most exciting parts of this is that we've found this species on private lands now. So they were totally on public lands before. We documented a new site with a timber company who's amazingly excited that they're out there, and we've been restoring habitat with them, been head starting with them. And so trying to increase that redundancy across the landscape. With their sister species, we've actually been involved with reintroducing them on private lands. I could give a whole another private land conservation talk, but that's a really exciting thing. So we've helped develop tools now and policies to be able to put these things on private lands with no risk and to get private landowners excited about the recovery process, which is really exciting. Ton of restoration, getting those things out. So here's a good example of what the wetland looks like. So I had it circled, but it might not have translated over. Oh yeah, there we go. So that's the same tree there. So this is a whole lot of work, a whole lot of people hours on the ground, getting these wetlands back to the point where they're suitable for this species. Again, putting a lot of work into head starting, getting them past those most vulnerable stages and growing larvae. And then you get these fun little dopamine hits where you get to release flatwood salamanders back in the wild. It's always fun. Kevin's gonna tell you he was involved with this stuff later. I don't believe him. He was. So with the Hickory Nut Gorge, we're doing the same sort of work. With that site that was destroyed, we were lucky enough that the rock remained. We were able to rather quickly for this kind of thing, work with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, get permits, and luckily the North Carolina Zoo agreed to start a captive population for them. And so this spring and then followed by this fall, we were able to develop this plan and get out and rescue a lot of those individuals from that population that survived, but that would have been lost to the heat from the rocks being exposed and all of that. Really cool. And so that's what this looked like. The habitat was obviously completely destroyed, and so we had to do all kinds of crazy rappelling down stream banks and climbing over all kinds of thickets and getting up to these rocks to get these salamanders out. Ben's gonna claim he was involved with this, but he wasn't. Yeah, I know. I was actually trying to think if you were in this, but is that you? That's you. That's right. I lied. Ben was involved. Yeah, just to kind of show you some of the logistics of getting out there, we had to have a safety person, Cam, who is amazing on site. She's a world-class caver rescue person that is just an amazing individual who's out there with us every time as a volunteer, which is really cool. And this is what it looked like, getting them out and getting them transported to the zoo and eventually at the zoo here. So now we have, as of last month, we have 25 individuals in this captive population, which is what the state allowed us to take out, and a full healthy now captive population that will be bred, and we're starting the process for identifying places where we could reintroduce the species across the landscape with the offspring of these guys. So pretty exciting turn of events, and of course we're working with the state and Fish and Wildlife Service and everything to continue to do work for the species and other parts of the range and recover other populations. And yeah, like I said, what we need is a framework to be able to do this at scale, and that's what we're trying to build. So unrelated to those species, but just in general, wanted to give the sort of finishing message that there's hope and that there's organizations out there doing this at scale. And last year alone, we detected 26,000 species or individuals, not species, individuals across the country. These are, we're targeting the rare and imperiled amphibians and reptiles. So we're getting out there, getting the necessary inventory and monitoring data, and then combining that with head starting and restoration efforts. And so last year we released over 1,600 head starts of various species, and we have this coming year we'll have 10 different programs for 10 different imperiled amphibians and reptiles, where we're head starting, where we're giving them a chance to rebuild those populations and meta populations using science-backed strategy kind of across the landscape. So I always like to think of you all doing this as students and how you fit in and what this looks like for you. And so I have a few, if you'll indulge my professorial needs to impart wisdom of just like how what you're doing can influence this and fill in. And the first is just to fill the science gaps that block action. So from my side, where we're trying to push conservation, we're trying to get work done. One of the most frustrating things in the world is that there's all kinds of people that are extremely conservative and block action. And a lot of that is because we don't have that information, and that's stuff that you all as students and projects and future researchers and conservationists can do. You can fill those science gaps that block the action. A big one, like for us, for example, right now is disease dynamics. I work a lot on getting poached turtles back into the wild, and that's like one of our biggest barriers is like the state's not wanting to put more disease on the landscape. And so understanding things like disease dynamics and natural systems is a big one. Produce decision relevant science, not just publishable science. So I think you all are much better set up for a lot of that than a lot of universities, just based on who you all are and what your focus is. But it's always worth reminding folks that, if you're trying to make a difference, decision relevant science is the most important thing. And a big one for me is this can convert uncertainty into actionable risk, right? And that's kind of gets at the first one, but we have to, in our field, get past the idea of saying why something's not going to work and figuring out the acceptable and actionable risk levels of those things. So we as scientists like to step back and say, oh, hold on, you didn't think of this, or you didn't think of that, or we got to make sure that this isn't going to happen. I liken this to watching a canoe like head towards a waterfall, right? And this is like our fault, mostly Kyle's fault, because he's older than me. But like for decades, we've been watching like this canoe like head towards a waterfall, and all of our generation, we're like, oh man, somebody should totally stop that, or like, look, this canoe is heading towards the waterfall, and now it's time that, we have to just be like, okay, well, it might be risky if we go out and throw a rope to them, but we've got to go out and throw a rope. So, so that's kind of a motto of mine. Oh, I put this one in here for Kyle. And the boots on the ground is always better than elegant objectives hierarchies. As much as we all love an elegant objective hierarchy. Another one is build novel tools that predict the future. So I think a lot of people, when they think of this, think of climate modeling and PVAs, but there's so much need in our field to develop tools that predict the future in other ways. How are reintroduction is gonna move across the landscape, how are disease dynamics gonna change, how are, you know, if we reintroduce individuals, how are the population genetics of that population gonna change? Well, how is it gonna move across the landscape? So we do a really good job trying to predict the future and the most difficult things to predict the future on, like climate change. But we do a really poor job at things that we could be doing in terms of conservation action. Sort of along the same lines, create rapid assessment tools, eDNA pipelines, remote sensing workflows, et cetera. These are things that need to happen quickly and that often slow things down. Evaluate what actually works. It's fairly obvious. And you know, maybe the biggest piece of advice I can give to anybody in your shoes is to ensure that your work is designed with conservation practitioners, not just with them in mind. So I see a lot of people that have ideas of what conservation practitioners need, but they never actually talk to those people, or they never actually run those ideas by them. And that is so incredibly important. And then to just do it all quickly. Because no problem. So with that, I'll just say thanks so much for having me and for putting up with my talk. And of course, thanks to all of our partners. And most importantly, I sit behind the desk most of the time now. And so I rely on my amazing staff, both at ARC and at Tank Bank. And to make this work, to make, you know, sort of my dreams of how this work happens, actually happen on the ground. That's the really important part. So thanks.
JJ, questions?
Yeah.
I have two questions actually. The first one is, so with the green salamanders that are at the North Carolina Zoo, are they like gonna be on display at all, or is it all behind the scenes?
I think it's gonna be mostly behind the scenes. I'm not totally sure, but I think they said they might put like one on display or like one enclosure. So they built these cool enclosures, so it'd be neat. They put some, but you know, to try to like recreate the rock habitat and crevices and stuff. So I'm not sure. I know they're undergoing a change in a lot of that department and what's on display.
And then my second question is, you said there was 8 different head starting programs. Is one of them gopher frogs?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I did my undergrad at NC State and like their Coastal Institute, CMAS, they have a gopher frog head starting program. Is that related to you guys?
So we do a different, well, we're all like working together and interrelated. We do one at Fort Stewart and one at Verdun and one on Francis Marion in South Carolina. So those are our 2 major gopher programs. But we're probably gonna increase that number as well. So, but yeah, gopher frogs are great because you can get a whole bunch of them. Like you know, it's hard. Like we do a lot of like bog turtle. And it's like when you get 3 eggs, it's a lot different than 1,000. Yeah.
I was just curious, is there any value in doing like small scale, like intensive restoration at some of those like nest rocks that have, you know, large parts of the population, but the surrounding environment is now like destroyed? Is there any value in doing that, I think?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've thought a lot about that and what that looks like, and we're still like exploring like what could we plant there that would be native, that would get a canopy up quickly. So yeah, it would be great. I mean, it's such a funky, weird species that they're so patchy that it's hard to get in really to understand like what are the factors that they need. And so that's part of what we're going to be doing. We've even thought about, and in fact, we still might at that site because the state only allowed 25, there's still individuals potentially there of like putting up shade cloth or, you know, but I always like to say that every like, you know, disaster provides an opportunity, and so it might allow us to learn a lot more about the species and what needs to be there. And so we'll be doing that. But yeah, certainly if we can restore that, great. But in most cases, it's like giant old growth, or, so it's hard to think how you would get that out of that.
So kind of feeding off Stephen's question, you talked about identifying places for reintroduction of the species, but it also seems like you guys have surveyed the area pretty well. Are you planning to put them in areas where they're not already found before, or like what's going into your thought process of finding reintroduction sites?
Yeah, so we're still working that out as well. There's been an offer to put them at a nature conservancy site where they've never historically been, but that looks really good, and so that we could like sort of do an experimental, red wolf isolated kind of experimental reintroduction. But there's also a lot of habitat at these sites that aren't occupied for whatever reason. We think that they probably were originally, so we still have to work out like really what that means. I think probably what we'll do is end up reintroducing to either historical sites that have been extirpated, or in very near rocks, so that we will understand how, that at least some of those needs are being met. So they're so like, I mean, you've seen it, like they don't often make sense to us. Like one rock will look just like another rock, and that one will have 20, and that one will have 0, and we don't know why.
Yeah, and like how many can you put on one rock?
Yeah.
Right. It's like you put them out there and they disappear. You
Yeah.
put 50 more on that same rock, or
Right. We've got a lot of thinking to do on that side of it for sure. But we probably have a few years before we have to answer that question. Yeah.
Just because I'm not super familiar with it, how do you decide like, okay, well, if we're taking some of these to the side to try to like take them to the zoo, how do we reduce further bottlenecking without taking too many from the population that's like still kind of doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you mean specifically with the Hickory Nut Gorge Green, or?
Yeah.
So with that one, they had lost the habitat, so it was easy. Because all those were likely gonna die, or at least any of their reproductive efforts were not gonna be successful anyway. For other species, yeah, we've had to make that call just based on like some of the modeling, the population modeling, and what are the impacts on that population. And bog turtles is a great example where we have several populations where we're, head starting and creating all these offspring. But we need to make sure that those are also keeping that population happy and healthy and growing, without taking too much from them. So it's building a lot of population models and trying to make those decisions with having a good hypothesis or
Question online, maybe more of a comment, but it'll hopefully bring up a question. So this relates back to earlier in your talk, setting up conservation in general. And the comment is, I think it would be more productive to say that both forms of conservation are needed, area-based and threat reduction within managed areas, rather than diametrically opposed one to the other. The reason many species that are not critically imperiled respond well to area-based measures, whereas critically imperiled specialists often need to. So keeping common species common, and actively managing the rarity is the primary concern. Problem is there are only so many conservation dollars to go around, so it's tempting to say one strategy is working better.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't trying to oppose the two. I was trying to point out the focus more on one than the other. And so the way I see it, we're heading into like sort of a new phase of conservation biology, right? So we've gone through the like advocacy, raising awareness phase. The second phase was in my mind is really like the phase of like protect as much habitat as we can. And we saw this like, thing, we're still seeing things like 30 by 30, but even if you look at like the Nature Conservancy, which went from saving the last best places to so that like that was a big need, was to like sort of stem the loss of bleeding and to protect as much as we could. But in my mind, you know, and then somewhere in there also, we've also had been in this era of habitat restoration and that sort of thing, but now we're entering into like an implementation phase in conservation biology. See this in the growth of a lot of nonprofits that are really booming and growing now compared to ones that are like shrinking and falling back. But yeah, I don't think they're diametrically opposed. There's just a huge need for the implementation side and the active recovery side. Whereas for a long time, we've been, you know, putting all our resources into the habitat protection side of it. Right, well, good, it's a growth of the field, right? It's like, we're getting to the more nuanced side.
How do you balance chasing a baseline status versus adapting to a changing regime of some sort?
Yeah. I think we're out of time. Yeah, I don't know. That's not something that I spend a whole lot of time thinking about, but it is a problem out there, and especially in terms of like, yeah, climate change and invasive species and that sort of thing. So I'm a believer, and this will probably make whoever said that, made that comment online, angry, but I'm a believer, like, you kind of have to, I think we have to manage for single species and single outcomes. And the reason I say that is because there's all these things that make it so difficult to manage for entire systems, and including change and shifting baselines and all this sort of thing. So when you focus on imperiled species and you focus on recovering those metapopulations, a lot of things are going to come along with it, get the like sort of umbrella effect. But also we can understand it much more clearly, and you can understand sort of like what we have to do to combat those shifting baselines or let them go, right? I think a lot about that with invasive species, and like we often draw the line of like, is that invasive species gonna like be detrimental to the recovery of the species or the metapopulation? So if it's out west and it's bullfrogs, like, yeah, we've got to deal with the bullfrog. If it's in the east and it's Kogon grass, is that going to affect like the recovery? It might. Like we have to look into that, but it might not. You just have to accept that like there's Kogon grass everywhere. So yeah, that's a tough problem that I'll let somebody else deal with. But great, but
Please help me thank JJ again then.